Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of ancient implant cases. We begin our journey in the quiet, climate-controlled halls of the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum in San Jose, California. Imagine the air here. It is cool, carrying the faint, dry scent of ancient cedarwood, linen, and the weight of thousands of years. The world outside the museum walls is bustling with the hum of modern traffic, but inside, the silence is thick and heavy, like a velvet blanket. In 1971, a peculiar transaction took place that would eventually baffle the scientific world. It did not happen in a dusty tomb or an active dig site under the scorching sun of Luxor. Instead, it began with a glossy page in a Neiman Marcus Christmas catalog. In a section titled, "His and Her Gifts for People Who Have Everything," 2 sealed ancient Egyptian coffins were offered for sale. The museum acquired them for $16,000, a sum that seems almost trivial now for the secrets they held. When the crates arrived, the staff noticed a soft, rhythmic rattling coming from inside one of the sarcophagi. They had expected an empty vessel, a beautiful piece of funerary art, but the sound suggested something remained within. Upon opening the heavy lid, they found not just dust, but the remarkably well-preserved remains of a man who would come to be known as User-Montu. The name User-Montu means, "Powerful is Montu," referring to the ancient god of war. However, as the researchers would later learn, the man resting inside was likely not the original owner of the coffin. He was a traveler through time, placed into a secondary sarcophagus centuries after his own death. For over 2 decades, he lay in the museum's quiet display, his red hair and 5-foot-tall frame shrouded in the mysteries of the New Kingdom. Visitors passed by him daily, unaware that beneath the brittle, resin-soaked bandages, a miracle of ancient engineering was hidden. It was not until 1995 that the veil began to lift. A team from Brigham Young University, led by Professor Wilfred Griggs, arrived at the museum. They were there to conduct a broad study, performing DNA analysis and X-ray scans on the 6 resident mummies to better understand their health and origins. The lab they set up was a contrast of worlds. Modern, sterile machinery stood alongside the blackened, bitumen-coated remains of the ancient dead. The hum of the X-ray machine was a low, rhythmic drone, vibrating through the floorboards as the scientists worked in the dim light, their eyes focused on the glowing monitors that sliced through the layers of time. When the team reached the mummy of User-Montu, the process seemed routine. The machine clicked and whirred, capturing the internal structure of the body. But as the image of the left knee flickered onto the screen, the room fell into a sudden, sharp silence. There, illuminated in the grainy black and white of the radiograph, was something that shouldn't have been there. A long, straight, metallic spike was embedded deep within the bone, connecting the thigh to the lower leg. It was a 9-inch iron pin, appearing so precise and so modern in its design that the researchers gasped. It looked like a piece of contemporary orthopedic hardware, the kind of surgical screw you might find in a modern hospital after a horrific accident. Professor Griggs stared at the screen, his mind racing. His first thought was one of disappointment. He assumed that the pin must have been a modern repair. He believed that some Victorian-era collector or an early 20th century curator had found the mummy's leg detached and had used a common industrial screw to pin the limb back together for display. It was a logical conclusion. After all, the idea of ancient Egyptians performing complex orthopedic surgery with iron implants seemed like a fantasy, a bridge too far for the medical knowledge of 2,600 years ago. The shadow of the pin on the X-ray was hauntingly perfect. It had a tapered, corkscrew-like end where it entered the femur, and the other end, nestled in the tibia, featured 3 distinct flutes designed to prevent the bone from rotating. These are the same biomechanical principles used by surgeons today to stabilize a fracture. The more Griggs looked at it, the more the mystery deepened. If it was a modern repair, how had they inserted it without damaging the surrounding linen? The bandages were undisturbed, their weave tight and brittle with age. To test his theory of a modern intervention, Griggs returned to the museum in November of that year to perform a more invasive examination. He moved slowly, his hands gloved and steady as he worked in the shadows of the gallery. He drilled a tiny hole into the bone to extract samples, a process that felt like a quiet conversation with the dead. As the drill bit moved, it brought up more than just metal. It brought up traces of ancient organic resin, a substance similar to the bone cement used in modern joint replacements. The resin was dark and sticky, smelling of the earth and the tomb. The analysis of that resin changed everything. It wasn't a modern adhesive. It was a mixture used during the mummification process, thousands of years old. Tucked alongside the metal were fragments of ancient textiles and traces of fats that had long since turned to a waxy substance called adipocere. These materials were fused to the iron pin in a way that only occurs over vast stretches of time. The evidence was undeniable. The pin had been placed in the leg before Usermontu was wrapped and laid to rest in his original tomb. Whether it happened while he was alive, as a desperate attempt to save a shattered limb, or shortly after death to ensure his body remained whole for the afterlife, remained a haunting question. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul needed a complete, intact body to navigate the trials of the underworld. A missing limb was not just a physical loss, it was a spiritual catastrophe. This iron pin, crude yet brilliant, was a bridge between the physical world and the eternal, a silent witness to a level of medical sophistication that history had forgotten. As the scientists looked at the 9-inch screw, they realized they were not looking at a modern mistake, but an ancient masterpiece of surgery. The air inside the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum in San Jose was thick with the weight of centuries. A heavy, still atmosphere that smelled faintly of dried cedar, old linen, and the peculiar metallic tang of filtered air. It was August of 1995. Outside, the California sun was likely baking the pavement, but within these walls, the light was dim and controlled, casting long, elegant shadows across the sandstone floors. Professor Wilfred Griggs stood in the silence, his footsteps muffled as he moved toward the gallery where the mummies rested. Among them was the one known as Usermontu. To the casual observer, he was a silent sentinel of the past, his mahogany-colored skin pulled tight over high cheekbones, his arms crossed over a chest that had not drawn a breath in over 2 millennia. But Griggs was not there for a casual observation. He had brought an X-ray machine, a heavy, clinical intruder into this sacred space, intending to peer through the bandages and bone without disturbing a single fiber of the ancient wrappings. The hum of the machine was a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse against the stillness of the room, a modern heartbeat echoing in a tomb of history. The process was slow and methodical. Each X-ray plate had to be positioned with absolute precision, the researchers moving with the grace of ghosts so as not to jar the fragile remains. They focused on the legs, where the linen was worn and the structure of the bone was visible in ghostly silhouettes on the emerging films. When the first images of the left knee began to develop in the dim light of the makeshift laboratory, a collective breath was held. There, cutting through the porous, gray shadows of the femur and the tibia, was a line of blinding, solid white. It was too straight, too dense, and too perfect to be biological. It was a metal pin, 9 inches long, driven directly through the joint to connect the upper and lower leg. The researchers looked at one another, the initial shock quickly curdling into a familiar, bitter skepticism. In the world of archaeology, such a sight usually meant one thing. This was not a miracle of ancient medicine, but a modern deception. It was the mark of a restorer or a tomb robber from the last century who had used a common hardware store bolt to pin a broken leg back onto a valuable artifact, making it whole enough to sell to an unsuspecting museum. Griggs felt a sinking sensation in his chest as he stared at the sharp, clinical edges of the metal. He had seen this before. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the trade in Egyptian antiquities was a wild, unregulated frontier. Mummies were often treated as mere curiosities, handled roughly and repaired with whatever materials were at hand: glue, wire, or modern nails. The professor assumed that at some point after Usermontu was pulled from the dry sands of Egypt, his leg had snapped at the knee. To keep the price high and the display intact, a modern hand must have bored a hole through the bone and hammered in this iron rod. It felt like a betrayal of the history he sought to protect. The pin looked like something you would find in a 1950s hospital, a piece of orthopedic hardware that had no business being inside a body that had died 2,600 years ago. He began to form a mental narrative of the fraud, imagining a dusty backroom in Cairo, where a merchant reached for a tray of iron screws to fix his broken merchandise. It was a logical, safe conclusion that protected the boundaries of what we believed the ancients were capable of doing. The details of the pin only reinforced this doubt. As they examined the X-rays more closely, they saw that the metal had a sophisticated design. It wasn't just a simple rod. It had a tapered, corkscrew-like end where it entered the femur, and 3 distinct flutes, or ridges, at the other end to prevent the bone from rotating. These were biomechanical principles that seemed entirely modern. To an orthopedic surgeon, it looked like a precursor to the pins used in total knee replacements today. The sheer complexity of the object made the idea of it being ancient seem laughably impossible. Griggs returned to his home in Utah with the images burned into his mind, convinced he was looking at a clever, albeit intrusive, repair from the last 100 years. He planned to write it off as an interesting footnote, a story of how modern hands had tampered with the ancient dead. He could almost feel the coldness of the iron as he imagined it being forced into the dry, brittle marrow of the mummy by a modern drill. The thought was clinical and sterile, stripping away the mystery and replacing it with the mundane reality of museum maintenance. But the mystery refused to stay buried under the weight of skepticism. In February of 1996, Griggs returned to the museum with a team of specialists, including an orthopedic surgeon and a radiologist. They needed to know for certain. They were prepared to find the drill marks of a modern tool, the bright, clean metal of an industrial screw, and the telltale signs of recent adhesives. They moved the mummy of Usermontu onto a table, his red hair catching the light like rusted wire. The room was silent, the only sound being the soft rasp of their breath and the occasional click of a camera. As they began to carefully peer into the space where the pin entered the bone, they expected to find the fraud exposed. Instead, they found something that made the hair on their arms stand up. There was no sign of modern entry, no shattered bone from a high-speed drill, no traces of 19th century glue. Instead, there was the same dark, amber-colored resin that they had seen throughout the rest of the mummification. The metal itself was not shiny or new. It was dark and integrated into the very fabric of the leg, in a way that defied every skeptical thought they had held. The more they looked, the more the modern deception theory began to crumble like old papyrus. They saw that the pin had been inserted with such care that it followed the natural contours of the leg's anatomy, a feat that would have been nearly impossible for a modern restorer to achieve without unwrapping the entire limb and risking total destruction. The realization began to dawn on them like a cold sunrise. This was not a fix made by a merchant in 1900. This was something else entirely. As they touched the aged, darkened surface of the bone, they realized they were looking at a level of surgical knowledge that shouldn't have existed. The skepticism that had felt so solid and intellectual was now being replaced by a profound, unsettling wonder. The pin was real, and it was ancient. But as one question was answered, 1,000 more began to swirl in the quiet air of the museum. How did they do it? Why was it there? And most importantly, what else had we gotten wrong about the hands that prepared these bodies for eternity? The modern world was about to be humbled by a 9-inch piece of iron. The air inside the laboratory at Brigham Young University carried a peculiar weight in the winter of 1996, a stillness that seemed to vibrate with the hum of high-precision machinery. The researchers moved with a practiced, rhythmic grace, their footsteps muffled by the sterile flooring, as they gathered around the remains of the man they called User Montu. The room was bathed in the cool, clinical glow of fluorescent lights, yet the ancient body seemed to absorb that light, remaining a deep, mahogany brown, like weathered cedar. Dr. Wilfred Griggs and his team prepared to do what once seemed impossible, to reach into the quiet depths of a 3,000-year-old mystery and pull out a piece of iron that should not, by any logic of the modern world, be there. They weren't just looking at a curiosity anymore. They were preparing to interrogate the very fabric of the past. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and the faint, dusty whisper of antiquity that always seemed to cling to the linen wrappings, despite the modern surroundings. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if the scientists feared that a sudden sound might shatter the delicate thread of history they were trying to pull tight. As the investigation deepened, the team brought in a specialized medical drill, a slender instrument capable of spinning at the dizzying speed of 75,000 revolutions per minute. The sound it made was a thin, silver needle of noise that pierced the heavy silence of the lab. As the drill bit moved toward the bone, there was a collective breath held in the room. When the high-speed metal finally made contact with the ancient tissue surrounding the pin, something remarkable happened. A soft, aromatic fragrance began to drift upward, filling the sterile air with the scent of a sun-drenched forest from 3 millennia ago. The friction of the drill had generated a sudden, intense heat, and that heat had reached the substance holding the iron bolt in place. To the amazement of the surgeons, a dark, resinous liquid began to weep from the bone, melting under the warmth of the modern tool. This was not a modern epoxy or a synthetic glue from the 20th century. This was an organic resin, likely derived from the sacred cedar trees of Lebanon, mixed with oils that had remained dormant and solid for over 26 centuries. The sight of that melting resin provided the first undeniable proof. No modern forger could have placed a pin so deep within the bone that it was sealed by a prehistoric cement that only returned to life when kissed by the heat of a high-speed drill. With the resin softened, the team was finally able to extract the 9-inch bolt, laying it gently upon a white tray where it looked like a dark, heavy shadow against the clinical plastic. Under the powerful magnification of the laboratory's microscopes, the true genius of the ancient metalsmith began to reveal itself. This was not a product of a factory or a standardized mold. The surface of the iron was covered in microscopic striations, the tiny, rhythmic scars of a hammer hitting glowing metal thousands of years ago. The analysis showed that the pin was composed of nearly pure iron, a metal that the Egyptians of the New Kingdom treated with a reverence usually reserved for the stars. There were no traces of the modern alloys, no chrome, no vanadium, no stainless steel. That would have signaled a contemporary origin. Instead, they found a metal forged in a charcoal fire, hammered by a hand that understood the unique temper of the Earth's raw elements. The scientists traced the edges of the bolt, feeling the slight irregularities that spoke of a human touch. A craftsman who had labored in the flickering orange light of a forge to create a tool of permanent restoration. The most startling revelation, however, lay in the mechanical design of the pin itself. It was not a simple rod of metal. As the light of the laboratory caught the flutes and grooves, the orthopedic surgeons in the room felt a chill of recognition. One end of the iron bolt was tapered into a delicate corkscrew, designed to bite into the soft interior of the femur with a grip that would not fail. The other end, which rested within the tibia, was forged with 3 distinct flutes, long vertical channels that acted as flanges. In modern medicine, we use this exact geometry to prevent a bone from rotating around an implant, ensuring that the joint remains rigid and stable. The team stared at the 3,000-year-old iron, realizing they were looking at biomechanical principles that the modern world believed it had invented only a few generations ago. The ancient smith had understood the physics of the human knee, the way the weight of the body would twist and pull, and had engineered a solution in iron that was as sophisticated as any titanium screw found in a modern hospital. It was a bridge of metal built across the chasm of time, designed with a precision that blurred the line between the ancient mystic and the modern engineer. By the time the sun began to set over the university campus, the verdict was absolute. The laboratory tests confirmed that the pin had been inserted during the mummification process, after the spirit had departed, but before the body was committed to the eternal silence of the tomb. The researchers found microscopic fragments of ancient linen and traces of lipids, the natural fats of the body, perfectly preserved and undisturbed within the crevices of the iron. Had the pin been forced into the leg in modern times, these delicate structures would have been crushed or scattered. Instead, they were found exactly where the ancient embalmers had left them, tucked away in the shadows of the knee joint. This was a labor of immense love and religious devotion. The forging of the bolt was not merely a mechanical repair, it was a sacred act of reconstruction. The ancients believed that for a soul to live forever, the body must remain whole and perfect. When this man's leg was severed, perhaps in a tragic accident or during the violence of war, the priests did not see a broken corpse. They saw a soul in danger of being lost to the void. And so, they turned to the finest metalsmith in the land to forge a bolt of iron, ensuring that Usermontu would walk into the afterlife with every limb intact, held together by a sliver of metal and a faith that refused to let the darkness win. The scent of sterile laboratory air and the hum of modern centrifuges begin to fade, replaced by something much older and more grounded. We move away from the white-tiled corridors of the university and travel across the sea to the rolling, verdant landscapes of northern France. Imagine the region of Essonne, where the soil is thick and dark, holding within its layers the secrets of a time when the Roman Empire was only just beginning to cast its long shadow over the tribes of Gaul. The air here is heavy with the smell of damp moss and ancient limestone. In the late 1990s, a team of archaeologists arrived at a quiet site known as the Necropolis of Chantamber. They were not looking for silver or gold, but for the stories written in the very bones of the people who had lived there during the 1st century. As they knelt in the soft, loamy earth, they began to uncover the remains of a man who had died in his early 30s, a silent inhabitant of a wooden chamber that had protected him from the weight of the world for nearly 2,000 years. The brushes moved with agonizing slowness, peeling back the centuries grain by grain. The archaeologists worked in a respectful silence, the only sound being the distant rustle of oak leaves in the French wind. As the skull of the man was revealed, something unusual caught the light. It wasn't the dull white of weathered bone, but a dark, jagged glint that seemed out of place in the natural architecture of the human mouth. Nestled within the upper jaw, specifically in the place of a missing premolar, was a piece of wrought iron. It was a crude yet deliberate object, shaped with striking precision to mimic the root and crown of a tooth. The researchers paused, their breath visible in the cool morning air, as they realized they were looking at something almost unheard of in the archaeological record of Western Europe. This was not a loose charm or a piece of jewelry fallen into the grave. This was an intentional, surgical intervention performed by an ancient hand. When the jawbone was finally lifted from the earth and brought into the light of the modern day, the true mystery of the iron tooth of Gaul began to unfold. Upon closer inspection under a microscope, the scientists found that the iron pin was not just sitting in the socket. It was fused. The human body is remarkably resilient, but it is also fiercely protective. It usually rejects foreign objects with a violent inflammatory response. Yet, in this man's jaw, the bone had performed a miracle of biology known as osseointegration. The living tissue had grown around the cold, forged metal, gripping it tightly and holding it in place as if it were a natural part of his anatomy. This suggested that the implant had not been placed after his death to make him look whole for the gods. No, this man had lived with a tooth of iron. He had spoken with it, eaten with it, and perhaps even felt the cold bite of the winter air conducted through the metal directly into his nerves. The implications of this discovery are enough to make one shudder. Think of the conditions under which such a surgery would have taken place. There were no local anesthetics in the 1st century, no sterile operating theaters, and no antibiotics to stave off the infection that surely loomed over every cut. The surgeon would have had to hammer that wrought iron pin into the raw, sensitive socket of the jaw with a terrifying level of force. We can almost hear the ringing of the hammer against the metal, the heavy silence of the patient, and the smell of blood and iron hanging in the air of a smoke-filled Celtic hut. The fact that the man survived long enough for the bone to heal and fuse with the metal is a testament to an incredible, almost forgotten level of medical skill. It challenges everything we thought we knew about the supposed primitive nature of the ancient Gauls, suggesting that their knowledge of the body and its ability to accept the unnatural was far more advanced than the history books once claimed. As we look at the dark, oxidized remains of that iron tooth, we are forced to wonder about the motivation behind such an extreme procedure. Was this man a warrior who lost a tooth in a glorious battle and sought to restore his intimidating visage? Or was he perhaps a person of high status, someone for whom a complete smile was a symbol of power and perfection that justified the risk of a slow and painful death? The iron has turned a deep, rusty brown over the 2,000 years it spent in the soil of Chantamber, but the story it tells remains sharp and clear. It is a story of human vanity, of the desperate desire to be whole, and of a surgical bravery that predates our modern world by 20 centuries. The wind still blows through the fields of Essonne, carrying with it the ghosts of these ancient innovators who were performing the impossible while the rest of the world was still learning the basic shape of the human heart. We are left to ponder the bridge between then and now, realizing that the shadows of our ancestors are never truly far away. Leaving the cold, oxidized iron of that ancient Roman burial behind, we drift across the vast, rolling expanse of the Atlantic, following the warm, salt-heavy currents toward the humid, vibrant heart of Central America. The air here is a thick, velvet curtain, heavy with the scent of damp earth, crushed hibiscus flowers, and the slow, rhythmic rot of the jungle floor. We find ourselves in the Ulua River valley of what we now call Honduras, where the sunlight filters through a dense canopy of emerald leaves in jagged, golden shafts. The sounds of the modern world fall away, replaced by the low, constant hum of cicadas and the distant, haunting cry of a howler monkey echoing through the mist. In 1931, an archaeologist named Dorothy Popenoe stood in this very heat, her hands stained with the dark, silty soil of a place known as Playa de los Muertos, the beach of the dead. She was meticulously brushing away layers of history, uncovering the resting place of a young Mayan woman who had lived over 13 centuries ago. As the dirt gave way, Dorothy found a lower jawbone, a mandible that seemed ordinary at first glance, but as the light hit the front of the jaw, something shimmered with a pale, pearlescent glow that did not belong to the dull white of human bone. Nestled into the sockets where the 3 lower incisors should have been were 3 pieces of shaped seashell. These were not just fragments haphazardly placed. They were carefully carved, meticulously ground down to mimic the natural curve and bite of a human tooth. They were darker than the surrounding bone, possessing a deep, iridescent luster that spoke of the ocean, miles away from this jungle burial. In the 1930s, the scientific community looked upon this discovery with a mixture of awe and deep skepticism. For decades, it was widely assumed that these shells were a form of funerary decoration, a beautiful but purely cosmetic addition placed into the jaw after the woman had passed. The prevailing thought was that ancient people, despite their monumental pyramids and complex calendars, could not possibly have performed a successful living dental implant. They believed the pain would have been too great, the risk of infection too high, and the biological rejection by the body an absolute certainty. And so, for nearly 40 years, the woman with the seashell smile was tucked away in a museum drawer, her secrets hidden behind the assumption of primitive limitation. The narrative shifted dramatically in 1970. A dental academic, driven by a lingering curiosity about the Mayan mandible, decided to subject the ancient jaw to the scrutiny of modern radiography. As the X-ray film developed, it revealed something that stunned the medical world. In the grainy black and white shadows of the image, the investigators could see that the bone had not simply held the shells in place like a stone in a setting. Instead, the jawbone had actively grown around the seashells. It had reached out with living tissue, weaving a tight, biological bond with the calcium carbonate of the mollusk. This process is what we now call osseointegration, a concept that modern dentistry considers the holy grail of dental restoration. The presence of this compact bone formation around the shell fragments proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that these implants were placed while the woman was very much alive. She had walked, eaten, and smiled with these pieces of the sea for years before her death. The discovery forced a total reimagining of Mayan medical skill, suggesting a level of biological understanding that was over 1,000 years ahead of its time. Imagine the scene in a Mayan city during the 7th century. The patient, a woman in her early 20s, would have been seated in the shade of a limestone plaza, the air thick with the smell of burning copal resin. The dentist, perhaps a priest or a highly specialized artisan, would have used a bow drill made of wood and tipped with obsidian or hard stone to prepare the site. The vibration would have hummed through her skull, a dull, rhythmic grinding as the damaged teeth were removed. There were no synthetic anesthetics, only the numbing properties of local plants, or perhaps the ritual trance of a ceremony. The shells themselves, likely harvested from the coast, were carved with incredible precision to fit the unique geometry of her jaw. They were tapped into place, a firm, pressure-filled sensation that would eventually lead to a miraculous healing. The body did not reject the shell as a foreign invader. It recognized the shared calcium structure and embraced it, fusing the ocean's treasure into the woman's very identity. There is a profound, quiet beauty in this ancient success. It tells us that the desire for wholeness, for a functional and beautiful smile, is a thread that runs through the entirety of human history. The seashell smile was not just a feat of survival, but a testament to a culture that viewed the body as a canvas for both art and sophisticated science. As we linger on the image of those 3 shimmering incisors, we realize that the line between the ancient and the modern is much thinner than we often believe. The Mayan woman of Playa de los Muertos carried the weight of the sea in her jaw, a secret held in the silence of the earth for over a millennium. Even now, the precision of those shell implants challenges our understanding of what is possible when human ingenuity meets the natural world. The jungle continues to whisper its secrets, and the mandible remains a silent witness to a time when the boundaries of medicine were pushed by those who dared to carve teeth from the treasures of the tide. Imagine, if you will, the sound of a patient, rhythmic hum. It is the sound of a bow drill, a tool of wood and string, rotating with a steady, hypnotic persistence. In the soft, hazy light of a workshop from 9,000 years ago, a craftsman sits with shoulders hunched, his fingers guiding a spindle tipped with a sliver of flint. The air is thick with the scent of cedar and the faint, earthy dust of ground bone. This is not just a scene of survival, but one of profound, focused intention. The tools of our ancestors were not crude instruments of a primitive age. They were the precise extensions of a brilliant, searching mind. We find ourselves now at the end of our journey through the echoes of ancient tools, standing on a bridge that spans the vast, silent ocean of time. We see the obsidian scalpel, a blade of volcanic glass so sharp that its edge is measured in mere atoms. It is a surface so smooth that it puts modern surgical steel to shame, capable of parting skin with such effortless grace that the body barely realizes it has been touched. These were the instruments that carved the path for the first dental implants, tools born from the earth and refined by a human hand that refused to accept the finality of loss. In the warm, humid air of ancient Honduras, a woman once walked with a secret held within her jaw. 3 small pieces of seashell, carved with the care of a jeweler and shaped to mimic the natural curve of her missing teeth, had been placed into her bone. For years, we thought these were merely funerary decorations, meant to give her a complete smile in the afterlife. But when modern eyes looked closer, through the magical lens of X-rays and scans, they found something that silenced the skeptics. The bone had reached out. In a slow, microscopic dance of healing, the woman's own jaw had grown around the seashell, anchoring it firmly in place. This process, which we now call osseointegration, was happening 2,000 years ago in the shade of a Maya temple. Think of the patience required for such a miracle. The patient would have felt the cool, smooth texture of the shell against her tongue, and the steady, quiet strengthening of her own body as it accepted the gift of the ocean. It challenges everything we think we know about the linear progression of progress. It tells us that the ancient world was not a place of darkness, but a landscape filled with individuals who looked at a broken smile and saw a way to make it whole again using nothing but the resources of the shore and the wisdom of their elders. The story shifts now to the cooler, mist-shrouded fields of northern France, in a place called Le Cherne. Here, a young woman was laid to rest over 2,300 years ago. She was buried in a timber chamber, surrounded by the quiet luxury of her station. But the most remarkable thing about her was a small, corroded pin of iron found exactly where her upper incisor should have been. Iron is a stubborn, difficult guest for the human body. It does not play well with the delicate tissues of the mouth. Yet, there it was, carved and shaped to match the dimensions of a human tooth. Perhaps it was a final act of devotion from a grieving family, a way to ensure she entered the halls of her ancestors in her full beauty. Or perhaps, in a moment of desperate ingenuity, an ancient healer tried to bridge the gap between metal and flesh. When we look at this iron pin, now red with the rust of 23 centuries, we feel the weight of their effort. We see the fire of the forge, the strike of the hammer, and the tiny, meticulous measurements taken by a craftsman who was trying to do something that wouldn't be truly mastered for another 2,000 years. It is a haunting, metallic echo of a desire that never dies, the desire to restore what has been taken by time. Along the golden banks of the Nile, the physicians of Egypt were weaving their own stories in wire. They used gold, the metal of the sun, because it did not tarnish, and it was soft enough to be manipulated by a gentle hand. They created bridges, binding donor teeth to the healthy ones with fine, shimmering threads of yellow gold. We can almost see the chief of dentists, a man named Hesiri, as he leans over a patient in the year 1600 before the Common Era. The air smells of honey and ground barley, which they used as an antiseptic paste. He works with a focus that transcends the centuries. These were not just repairs, they were works of art. The gold wire would have been tied in intricate knots, hidden from view, holding a piece of ivory or a carved bone tooth in place, so that a person could once again eat, speak, and laugh without shame. In one particular find from a tomb in Giza, the dental work was so sophisticated that it remained intact for 4,500 years. It waited in the dark, silent sand, a testament to a level of medical care that rivals our own in its compassion, if not its technology. It reminds us that the history of medicine is not a straight line, but a series of peaks and valleys. Where ancient masters reached heights we are only just beginning to rediscover. As we reflect on these ancient cases, from the flint drills of the Indus Valley to the jade inlays of the Maya children, we realize that the timeline of human history is far more vibrant and complex than our textbooks suggest. These were people who understood the properties of pine sap as an antiseptic, who knew how to use bitumen and beeswax as fillings, and who saw no boundary between the work of a jeweler and the work of a healer. They were the pioneers of a science that seeks to mend the broken parts of ourselves. When you feel the weight of your own life, remember that you are part of a long, unbroken chain of problem solvers. We are the descendants of those who looked at a loss and reached for a stone, a shell, or a piece of gold to fix it. The mystery of these ancient implants isn't just in how they did it, but in the spirit that drove them to try. It is a spirit of resilience, of beauty, and of an enduring hope that we can always find a way to be whole again. The echoes of their tools have faded into the silence of the earth, but the knowledge they left behind remains, a quiet reminder that we have always been capable of the extraordinary. Our journey through the deep past concludes here, amidst the dust of forgotten workshops and the brilliance of ancient gems. The hands that held the obsidian and the gold are long gone, but their legacy lives in every smile we take for granted today. Let the image of the flickering fire and the rhythmic hum of the bow drill carry you into a peaceful rest. You are a part of this grand, ancient story, protected by the wisdom of those who came before. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.